So yeah, welcome everyone to another Regenerative Finance Lab. These sessions started out as being primarily focused on work that we were doing in Barichara, Colombia. So they were like the Regenerate Barichara sessions, but we were always talking about regenerative finance and governance and related topics. And then there was a time last fall where we really made a clear shift to this being the Regenerative Finance Lab, and that we would focus on the Earth Regeneration Fund and all of the related elements that came with that. And so, like Steve Melville, who's here today, I hosted a 4-part session on the promise of the Earth Regeneration Fund. And so we've had a very dynamic array of conversations. The most recent session in this space 2 weeks ago was about the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund, which is also in Colombia. But today, what we're going to talk about is Tierra Sagrada, which is Spanish for sacred earth, or if you wanted, you could say sacred land. And Tierra Sagrada is a project that Penny and I are soon to be the co-founders of, likely with another third co-founder that we are confirming in the next few days, because we need a minimum of 3 founders for the legal form that we're taking. And what we're going to be doing with this work, in a deep sense, is some of the most important decolonizing work that needs to happen, which is the decolonizing of the human relationship with land. And then by extension, the human relationship with the entire planet. Because at a certain level, we should think of it as completely insane to feel like we could take our mother's body and cut it into little pieces and own pieces of it. That's completely insane. And that's what private land does. You know, the great mother, Mother Earth, Gaia, Pachamama, whatever name you want to give to this incredible planetary being, to divide her into pieces and have dominion over her is sacrilegious, to put it mildly, and a major source of harm in the world. And so what we're going to talk about today is a pathway to how to bring land into the commons and to restore that sense of the sacred in our relationships with land. And so there are really like 2 parts or 2 levels to this, if you will. One is the practical, the almost mechanical, the like, what are the steps and the processes to bring land from private land into a commons framework, which some of you here have quite a bit of knowledge about. And for some of you, that'll be a new topic. And then the other is, how do we restore a relationship of the sacred and a sense of consciousness about the sacred to our relationships with land, which I would argue is absolutely vital for this to work. And one of the interesting things in the Colombian context is that the idea of a community land trust doesn't really exist in this context legally. So there are various forms of common ownership of land in Colombia. For example, with the constitutional change of the early 90s, all of the territorial lands were given back to the indigenous people. I'll put in quotes, given back to the indigenous people. So there are indigenous territories, like 24% of the land area of Colombia is legally owned and collectively by indigenous people. But because those lands are not structured as functioning commons, the worst forms of violence and extraction occur on indigenous lands in Colombia, which is the assassination of environmental leaders and indigenous leaders, mining companies coming and pillaging. A lot of that happens on indigenous territorial lands, even though they, quote, own it. And so there's something really significant about management frameworks and the sacred, in addition to the structure of ownership in a general legal sense. And so what we're going to be talking about today is a way of structuring the process of bringing land into the commons so that it can be collectively owned or managed in a community way, but in a way that also functions, and meaning a way that in a practical sense can actually work. And so that's our goal for today. And I have a presentation that I gave in Spanish on Monday, and then I translated it into English to give it today, which was kind of a fun reversal. I usually go the other way, because I gave this presentation to our territorial foundation, which is called Fundación Barichara Regenerativa, so that we could establish clear diplomatic relationships and synergies between the work of the territorial foundation and the work of this new organization that we're creating. And so one thing I'm going to do is pass to Penny. Where are you, Penny? I'm going to pass to Penny the ability to mute microphones or anything we might need to do while I'm presenting. So I've made you co-host. And now I'm going to give a presentation that I think will only take about maybe 10 or 15 minutes, which means I think I'm going to like open a can of worms. I think we're going to have a lot of things that will come up that we'll want to talk about, and we'll have lots of time to talk about it. But first, I'll give the context of Tierra Sagrada and how we are forming it. So let me jump into presentation mode. Here we go. So Tierra Sagrada, like I said, literally translates as sacred earth. So it's a sacred earth Barichara. And one of the things that Penny and I did last year was we worked with a graphic designer to create a logo where we wanted the logo to be inspired by the indigenous pictograms of the Guane people of this territory, but that wasn't actually one of their symbols. And so this the symbol you see on the left is inspired by the aesthetic of Guane language, their written language, but is not actually one of their pictograms. We didn't feel it was appropriate to use symbols of their language and culture, but we wanted something that was still in a harmonious relationship to the territory. And this image on the right, this is the spirals. It's a stone sculpture created by an Italian woman named Vito, who happens to live in Barichara. And she goes there every afternoon and maintains this space as a loving meditation. And many people who come to Barichara experience the sacred by going to these spirals. And these spirals are right at the top of the bioparque that I talk a lot about in Barichara. So what I want to do now is share with you this idea of an organization, Tierra Sagrada Barichara. The purpose of this organization is to transform private land into regenerative commons, which is to say that there is land that is privately owned. Someone has a land deed, or in Colombia, they'd call it an escritura, which is the name for a deed. And this land is owned by someone, and that person can do all kinds of things with it. And this land in this picture, this is a drone photo I took last year. This is land that someone, the language they'd use here is they'd say limpiar, which means to clean, that someone bought this land, cleaned it by taking a bulldozer and scraping all of the vegetation off of it, which is the way of creating a billboard that says this land is for sale and you can build a house here. So you basically have to destroy the land and all of its ecological function in order to demonstrate that someone could then build a house on it. That's a standard practice in Barichara. And you can see there's no sense of the sacred in that. And so the idea behind Tierra Sagrada is this idea that humans are owners of Mother Earth, that we actually think of that as a cultural sickness. And one of the root causes for division among people and the division between humans and the rest of nature. So by being able to say, this land is mine and that land is yours, we create divisions between people. Or saying, I own land and you don't, creates division between people. And then also saying this land is for housing, but not for a forest, is dividing humans from nature. And there are many different kinds of violence that are enacted by parcelizing land, by dividing it into little chunks of private ownership. And we feel like that needs to be undone, that we have to undo that. And that's probably the work of 100 to 200 years. So one of the things that we thought of was to create an organization called Tierra Sagrada that makes it possible to do things that a lot of members of our community want to do. Like we want to make it possible to create learning ecosystems. How do you learn collectively about local textiles, about natural construction materials, about medicinal plants? How do you learn reforestation and watershed restoration? How do you learn syntropic agroforestry or agroecology or permaculture practices for food forests? So we want to make it possible to create learning ecosystems that are not limited to a single piece of land. We also want to restore and reconnect biological corridors, the natural pathways of connectivity for the living systems of our place. So this is things like the flow of water in a stream bed, or the migratory pathways of mammals, or the flight patterns of birds. That we want to restore biological corridors that are at a larger scale than parcels of land. And now we want to work with nature reserves and the conservation of natural ecosystems. We want to be able to create different kinds of cooperation among local actors so that we can create frameworks that are new and different from what exists today. And part of doing this is the work of dissolving our mental models. That many people have divided the world into little squares and cubes, and then they think, well, this is my land and that's yours. And we want to dissolve those ways of mentally dividing the world and instead cultivate pathways so that we can imagine and dream and create other configurations of relationships, so that we can create mycelial webs, that water can unite us, that we can create movement patterns of animals and humans cooperate in it, or that we can do things like restore the top of a watershed to bring water to security to the people living at the bottom of the watershed. That right now we have to dissolve our mental models about land ownership to be able to do all of that. And so just as an example, this is a graphic some of you have seen before. These are all pieces of land that we have a direct relationship with through our education work with children. So the Bioparque Mooncora, is a place where lots of children in the territory go to learn about the tropical dry forest of our region. Las Ruinas is a piece of land that we're in the purchase of converting into a commons by making it the future home of our school, Sueños del Bosque, and as a place for creating a community ecology learning center for the Bioparque. That in the bottom left, Totumo used to be an alternative school, and Penny and I bought that land last year, and now it's in the process of becoming a community learning and healing space. And then up at the top of the image, Origen del Agua is a 3-hectare piece of land that was completely eroded and degraded. We bought that land in 2021 with crowdfunding money to begin a major watershed and reforestation ecosystem restoration work, but with lots of educational components. And then the land, the Maloca, that's up in the right, is the current home of our school, Sueños del Bosque, where children go to learn about themselves, social and emotional well-being, human flourishing, as well as regeneration of the territory. And so you can see these different pieces of land have land titles, land deeds that divide them. But our learning processes are relationships that move across them like an ecosystem. So by dissolving the physical boundaries of ownership, we open up the possibility of different kinds of exchanges and relationships between them. And this is the kind of dreaming and imagining that Tierra Sagrada is going to help us to do across the entire territory. So how do you structure an organization that does this? Well, in Colombia, there are some really interesting legal forms that are different from other places. One of them is that there's this form called a nonprofit corporation, a corporación sin ánimo lucro. And what's interesting about a corporation in Colombia is that a corporation can be for-profit or nonprofit, that it can have members or not have members. But you could also have other kinds of member-based organizations. You could have a member-based association, or you could have a member-based cooperative. But an association and a cooperative in Colombia, the members can actually change what the mission of the organization is. Whereas a corporation that has members, the members cannot change the mission of the organization, which means that a nonprofit corporation functions like a foundation. You know, a foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is secure. So if you donated money to a foundation, you would know that if its purpose is the restoration of native forest, that the money you give is guaranteed to go to that mission. But if you gave that money to an association or a cooperative, according to Colombian law, the members of the cooperative could vote by majority vote and change the mission, and you have no guarantee the money will go to that purpose. Whereas a nonprofit corporation is a structure that combines these elements. It functions as a member-based cooperative while protecting the purpose, which means that the members cannot change the mission because the mission is in the statutes of its legal constitution. And actually, a member can be expelled from membership by violating the purpose of the organization. So if someone comes into Tierra Sagrada and tries to bring land into the private market for sale, there are actual rules in our statutes that allow us to kick that member out so that we protect the purpose of the organization. And so our legal structure is called a corporación sin ánimo lucro con miembros, or said another way, a nonprofit corporation with members. And this allows us to get really creative in how we govern with this legal structure. Notice how this functions a lot like a community land trust if you add the right elements to it. So for example, we have a core team, which is called our Junta Directiva, or our executive committee. And our executive committee executes the purpose of the organization, just like an executive council of a nonprofit would do. This is your president, secretary, treasurer, those kinds of basic structures. That's our core team for the organization. Then we have land stewards who are associated with different land-based initiatives in the territory who are invited to become members. And I'll show you how that works in a moment, which means they can vote on things that are priorities and preferences, and they can create a kind of accountability for our executive committee so that we have a general assembly that's comprised of our executive committee or our core team and land stewards connected with the projects, the land-based projects that become part of this organization. And then we just have a general assembly that can invite members of the community who care about our mission to join the organization and vote on the issues of the organization and help shape and guide how this executive committee functions, creating the appropriate checks and balances and feedbacks for the governance of the organization. But how do we invite these land stewards and this general assembly in? One way we do it is that there are different processes or projects. So for example, each of these three circles might be one of those pieces of land I mentioned earlier. There might be the piece of land Totumo, which used to be an alternative school, and we're creating a learning center. Another one might be Las Ruinas, the future home of our school, Sueños del Bosque. What we do is for each of those distinct projects or processes is we invite representatives to join a council of stewards for each piece of land. And then we invite those local actors who are land stewards to join the membership of the organization. So let's take Las Ruinas, this land that aspires to be the future home of our regenerative school for children. We've identified different social actors, and I'll explain this more in a moment. We found 4 key actors who represent different processes in the community and are connected with Las Ruinas. We can invite them to become members of the organization. And in this way, as we add projects or add land to Tierra Sagrada's portfolio, we have a way of inviting people to join the assembly and to vote on the issues and participate in the governance of the organization, including that we might buy a piece of land or someone might donate a piece of land. And then we invite them afterwards to still represent key processes on that land. And they can still have some say about the land in the future, even after they sold it. And we change those relationships between land ownership and decision-making through the flexibility of a stewardship circle. Here we have multiple stewardship circles, one for each piece of land or project, but they represent in collective the general assembly of the organization. So what that means is that in practical terms, what we do with Tierra Sagrada is, yes, we can buy land or receive land by a donation, but the most important work we do is creating social agreements. So as I mentioned before, there was this piece of land called Las Ruinas. We identified 4 principal actors, which are 4 different organizations in the territory who have a stake, who have an important interest in the project Las Ruinas being managed well. So we gathered these representatives. This is a photograph from a meeting we had in January with representatives of Asociación Aquí Leopada, which is a member-based association that is the owner of Bioparque Moncora, and it's the seller of the land. We're buying the land from them. And then we invited the 2 women, Camila and Vicky, who founded Bioparque Moncora, which does a lot of reforestation work and community education work. We invited them to this circle to represent Bioparque Moncora. And then we invited Felipe and Ana Maria from Sueños del Bosque, which is the regenerative school that would like to have its home on this land in the future. And then Penny and I, as the founders of Tierra Sagrada, came to represent Tierra Sagrada. So basically, the way it works is like this. We have a project, Las Ruinas. Las Ruinas envisions being a home of a regenerative school for children, but also could be multi-use and multi-purpose. It has some relationship with the Bioparque, but we don't know what it is. So we need to create a specific customized model for what is its purpose, how is it managed, and who needs to participate. And we initially created a circle of representation with 4 key actors to create the framework for what this is. And then we would know how to invite others in and who to invite in to help govern Las Ruinas in the future. And this is all about creating healthy social agreements. So Tierra Sagrada creates a pathway for creating these social agreements for each piece of land that comes into the commons. And the commons is governed by this circle of stewards. And so that's how Las Ruinas is set up. We would do the same thing for Origen del Agua or any other land that comes into Tierra Sagrada. Now, an example of this in a different context outside of Colombia is one that I think is really inspiring, and it's one from the western slopes of the Colorado Rockies, a project, a nonprofit organization that's more than 20 years old called the Aspen Valley Land Trust, which is in the Roaring Fork River, which is one of the major headwater rivers of the Colorado River. And you can see here on the left what the Roaring Fork Valley looks like in the town of Carbondale, which is a really beautiful place. And what you can see in this graph here, this map, is the entire watershed is the high part of it is Aspen on the western, or the right part of this image. And you're going downhill as you go to the right. By the time you get to places like Parachute or Rifle, you're down in the desert and moving toward Utah. And in this map, every piece of land that is red is part of a distributed network of land connected with the Aspen Valley Land Trust. The Aspen Valley Land Trust protects open land and special places across this major watershed system for wildlife corridors, for regenerative agriculture, and for the community to benefit in a long-term stable way through land trust methods. And what's beautiful about this example is you can see that it's very much a bioregional framework, a major watershed system with land connected into corridors and into types of land for things like agriculture, for forest conservation, for river and watershed restoration, for wildlife corridors, for human recreation and harmony with all of these other needs. And the Aspen Valley Land Trust coordinates all of this across a very large area. And we envision Tierra Sagrada having a similar map in 20 years of pieces of land connected geographically across our territory, serving the same purpose, serving the commons of our watersheds and our biological corridors and our native biodiversity, and integrating human relationships into the land. And so that's the presentation I wanted to give you to show you that in order to make land sacred, we have to change our relationship to it. And one of the key steps is to bring land from private ownership into the commons. But to bring it into the commons is a process of creating social agreements and governance around collective purposes, dissolving our existing mental models and imagining distinct forms of relationships. And that is the work that we are now doing with Tierra Sagrada and Barichara. And so you can see how part of this is very practical. How would you set up a nonprofit appropriate to your local context? How would you set up governance and invite people to participate? How would you create customized governance for each unique context? And so there's got all those fractal elements built in. But then at a deeper spiritual level, it's inviting us into conscience and ethical relationship and working toward restoring the sacred in human relationships with the land in a territory where the indigenous culture has been almost entirely destroyed. There are remnants of the culture here really strongly damaged.
Section out here, I think about 20 here. What section?
Penny, can you? Thank you. I wasn't sure who that was. So what I'd love to do is invite some discussion. Are there questions or comments that you have about this model and this approach? And I'll just say that part of this work is that we've been working on this for about 5 years and we're about to legally constitute. So I'll just give you a sense of context. We've been building the social web on the land so that we'd know the form to take. Penny, I'd love to pass it over to you to add any other comments you'd like to give.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add in that one of the interesting things about what we're doing is we're thinking about, well, there's two things. One thing is that we're thinking about this, not that we have to buy the land, necessarily buy the land. So we have two different ways that we're thinking of working. One is that if there is no steward for the land, that the organization could actually buy the land. But the other, and maybe more interesting, is that people who actually want to come together in social agreements with land that they already own could become a part of Tierra Sagrada. And so, and that there's already a steward, they're the steward, and coming into these social agreements without having to buy land, but through the agreements and through social agreements, being able to accomplish the same thing. So that's one thing that's very interesting. The other part is that we were thinking a lot about reciprocity in our agreements with all the different kinds of actors. So, for example, with if there's donors or donors who are contributing money to buy land, what is the reciprocity agreements with them? What's the reciprocity with the people who, if they own the land or they're selling? So what is it that they need in reciprocity? Do they need access to the land for their family, going forward? Or what kind of reciprocity agreements do we have with the people who own the land or who are stewarding the land? So yeah, so we're thinking about that's just a couple examples, but all the different kinds of reciprocity agreements, so that we ensure that this is sort of at the heart of the whole thing is reciprocity between the different actors.
Yeah, thank you for that, Penny. And just to name that, with Las Ruinas, we offered to not buy the land. We said, we will give you money to the association that needed money, but maybe give them less money, but they could keep the land deed, the title. But they said, well, we don't want to be responsible for managing it, which means they didn't want to steward the process. So we said, okay, well, then what do you want to do? They said, we want to sell it. We want the money. So we said, okay, then we negotiated a price and we bought it. But then we invited them into the stewardship circle afterwards so they could still participate. So you see, we're dissolving a lot of the logic of how the purchase of land happens in sometimes surprising ways. Like they said they didn't want to participate, so we took the pressure off. But then we invited them to participate and they actually want to, now that it's not about money. So all these weird things that happen in decolonizing our relationships. So just to give that as an example. Thank you, Penny. And lots of hands up, so I'll pass it over to Julie. Over to you.
Yeah, that was really good addition, Penny. Thank you. And your response, Joe. I assume this works with intentional communities and eco villages. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, I would say that this could be a way of setting up some of the functions and structures of an intentional community. So like, for example, it might be that we take the model of co-housing where you divide, as some of you know, like you take the bundle of rights associated with land and break them apart. So the people in the co-housing don't own the land, but they own rights to access and use land that you can debundle in that way. We see that in the realm of community agreements. And so that might be a way of taking a large piece of land and providing housing for some people within it in a sort of co-housing framework, which could lead toward an eco-village or an intentional community. And I would say where we are in Barichara, there is not an intentional community here, but there is one nearby over on the way to Charla, one called El Tejido. And they have already set themselves up as an eco-village and may have some lessons to teach us, or we might have some legal models for them. We haven't explored it yet. But I see that as being a useful inquiry in the future. So yeah, I see it as being very much harmonious with that kind of an approach, for sure. Thank you, Julie. And then Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. This is really exciting to hear, and also very resonant with the journey that I've been on with Tiny House Community Bristol over the last few years. And I was also talking with our local land trust about expanding on this idea. And it seems that the community benefit society form of governance is similar to a non-profit corporation. So, and Tiny House Community Bristol, we set that up as like the mothership, if you like. And so the mothership has all the rules written into its society, which no one can change. And we referred to that as like the maypole of of the organisation, holding the vision, mission and aims. And then we saw ourselves as guy rope holders to hold on to the maypole. And then as each bit of public land that we were bidding for, that our local council was disposing of through the land disposal policy, and we would bring that land in, and then it would become its own housing cooperative using co-housing principles, and it would be under the mothership, if you like. So very sort of similar, and then overlaying sociocracy with all the governance as well. So all the circles and everything. So that's brilliant. And one of the things which I wanted to pick up on was what John Hepworth put in the chat, which is what guarantees that the humans execute the mission. And I think this is where I've got quite a lot of experience now. And it also speaks to the inner work that Penny's holding as well. Yes. And one of the many things I've learned is that when you've got like the founding members who are setting this up, it's fantastic. Everybody's like on the same page, and you're co-creating vision, mission and aims, and and then maybe a year or two down the line, and people's circumstances might have changed, and you need to do a recruitment exercise. And so you're bringing new people in who haven't been on that journey with you. And so it became really clear very quickly that how do you meet people where they are and hold on to the guy ropes of your maypole? Because I was sort of felt it in my body. I was like, no, don't move the maypole. You can't change the maypole. The maypole's the maypole. And and that can create a lot of conflict, and then a lot of frustration around sociocracy because they haven't gone through the neurological, emotional, sociological shifts. So yeah, I think that is going to be, I think that's one of the key crunch things, like how do we hold that transition, and also how do we build capacity within our organizations to hold new people as they come in, and also help them to understand that they are joining the project and the project is not joining them.
Rachel, this is so important, and thank you so much for elaborating in such a clear way for us to feel the significance of it. I'll only name one thing because we have a long line of hands and I want to be sure everyone can speak. But one of the things that we're doing is we have a person in our group named Felipe Medina, and Felipe is really good at transforming conflict with evolutionary potential, where there's a potential to evolve into something better, but you have to take conflict and transform it. And one of the things that we're doing is bringing in conflict. This is actually part of learnings from things that went wrong a couple of years ago, is we're bringing in conflict early in the process in a safe container to start to address it before it's big. And just as an example, we invited 2 people to join us representing the association, Aki Leopara. They were at our meeting in January. Those 2 people just had a big conflict where one of them was the standing president of the association. The other one was a previous president, and they had an election. And now that Penny and I brought money to the association, the previous president wants to come back in and decide what's done with that money. And he had more political clout and had the other guy kicked out, and was so, in a sense, bad about it that the other guy actually renounced his membership and left the organization. All of this happened last week. So now Penny and I are like in a place of, with Felipe, we're talking about how do we go and identify what's happening there and update our understanding of the association's role in this process with Las Ruinas. So we invite the conflict and we invite the shadow, just as an example of this has to happen. You have to have space for it.
Yeah, if I can just say one more thing, is that was what I was trying to do with Tiny House, but the other directors wouldn't embrace it, so I had to move on. So I'm now moving to South Devon. Anyway.
Oh, sorry to hear
Yeah.
that, but you have such great learnings. And the third co-founder we've invited is Felipe, because he's been helping us to do that process.
Amazing. Oh
like
my
what a good
God,
person
he's
to
going to
have.
be so important. Yeah.
So yeah,
Keep going.
To be continued on that front. Thank you, Rachel. And John, thanks for your patience. Over to you.
Yeah, hi, and thanks for this. It's I love hearing about the processes of conflict resolution because that is ongoing. And I wish I could remember the name of the guy. He was one of the guys that negotiated the Colombian government and the FARC finally reconciling, and there was a name for that. Anyhow, I'll find that later for that process. Yeah, so I guess what I'm very interested in is the notions of perpetuity and how you manage for bad actors. And I suppose I'm also kind of interested in is, do you want to lock the mission in or have it be open to evolution? Because things do change, and members change and priorities change and all those things. And to the piece about welcoming in new members, my experience with this is we had 3 kids go through an alternative school, and that was over 14 years. So when we arrived at that school, we were totally the newcomers, and there was a whole culture of what went on, and people were deeply invested in how they did things. One of which was going skiing, which seemed very weird to other parents who were more kind of like, well, that's just pouring gas. You know, what skiing is incredibly energy intensive. And the thing we found there, and I was on the Conseil d'Établissement, it was called, for 10 years. And what I found there was almost every springtime there was a conflict. It was like people had spent too much time in the winter in their own head, and so something would explode on Facebook, asbestos in the walls, lead in the water, whatever it was. And the thing I found in that, and I had never participated in a meeting before, and it was almost kind of like every meeting you have to almost rederive from first principles why you're there and why you do things the way you do them. And that's part of life too. Like we have to keep rederiving what we're doing and why we're doing it. And we have to be open, and this is a bit maybe to the point of being open to the change when our situations or our understandings change. And maybe what I'll leave it with is a bit of the question on the spiritual side of things. Because the thing I think I'm very aware of as someone whose personal journey with spirituality was very adversarial for years, because the version that seemed to be being imposed was not for me. And so I like the language very much when people speak for themselves and all the rest of it. But on to that point is we're all first timers, and so we're all at different stages of that process. So we almost want systems of government where you don't have to buy the whole picture at the beginning. You can hop on the bus at the first stop, and maybe you'll go to the same place as everybody else, and maybe you won't. But anyhow, and so it's kind of the question is about is locking in the mission the right form of government, or do you want to be able to like amend the Constitution? And then just kind of to the as was already discussed, controlling for bad actors.
Thank you, John. I will give another short answer and then go on to the next person as well, but I want to address this a bit. Part of this is in the art of writing the mission. If you write a really good mission, it's going to be inclusive and flexible, but also clear in intent. And so our intent is the regeneration of our territory with the bringing of land into the commons as what this organization does. So they see it's specific in intent, but also general, like how do you regenerate the territory? What are its priorities? That's a big open space. And that's why the meeting we had on Monday was so important, where we spent 3 hours beginning to identify what is the relationship between Tierra Sagrada and Barichara Regenerativa. Because Barichara Regenerativa is our territorial foundation, whose mission is to regenerate the territory. Tierra Sagrada's mission is to bring land into the commons to help regenerate the territory, which means naturally these two organizations should be friends, right? They're in a natural like a campo natural. They're in a land together that is a shared space. And so one of the things we talked about, which is a major source of tension with me as a human being in this territory, is I've had this incredible power to bring money beyond what other people have been able to do in Barichara. But then the question is, why does Joe decide what land is bought? And you can see that's a really good question, right? That's not a bad question at all. And so one of the things we talked about on Monday was who sets the priorities of which land comes into the commons for Tierra Sagrada. And what we agreed was that in practical terms, we're not there right now. But where we want to go is some really powerful participatory processes of territorial governance that tell us. So one of the things we talked about was a strategic priority of Tierra Sagrada could be the hydrological recharge areas. There are specific areas that have already been mapped for recharging our aquifers. Well, what if we just put a map down and said, those are the places that Tierra Sagrada prioritizes? Why? To create community aqueducts that are owned and managed by the community. And you can see there's a strategic alignment between Tierra Sagrada, regeneration of the territory, and what the Territorial Foundation does. So that's a very good example of that kind of alignment, which gives the organization flexibility, but keeping the intent clear. And the feedback is held not at the level of the organization's mission, but at the level of territorial governance, which can shape and inform where the organization moves through the territory as time goes on. Now, we're in very early days of that. So, check back in 5 years and see how we did. But you see that we're creating context where there's basically accountability at different levels within the organization and in the larger community. So that's part of the answer, but then there's so much more to say. I'll stop there for now and pass it over to Victoria and Jonathan.
Well, I just had a question because, of course, I'm trying to apply all of this to our situation here in the Genesee Finger Lakes. How is Tierra Sagrada different than a land trust that we might interact with here? Because there are several land trusts, and I'm not even sure how they're structured, from a legal standpoint, or how they get along with each other. But how is Tierra Sagrada just the first iteration of a land trust in Barichara?
Yes. So first of all, the idea of a land trust is not common in Colombia. So if you say those words, even in Spanish, most people in Colombia will have no idea what you're talking about. And so you have to give an example. Like I gave the example of the Aspen Valley Land Trust because I think their model is awesome. And I've seen other land trusts that I would not have used as my model. So I think part of the answer to your question is, what is the level of consciousness and what is the scale of holism for the land trust? I know if you were to talk to Kitu and Ches down on the Housatonic River in Connecticut, they would tell you that they actually ran into a problem that the land trusts there, the ones that they were working with, this is Connecticut. These are really wealthy people in Connecticut. There are a lot of really wealthy people in Connecticut. And a lot of those people have really good lawyers and they can just buy land and do whatever rich people want to do with the land, which is what a lot of land trusts in Connecticut do. Whereas if you're up in the Hudson Valley, up in the Mohawk River, and you got the mountain keepers and the river keepers, you might have land trusts that are much more like what you want. And so I think the level of consciousness of the land trust is important. And that's why I like the Aspen Valley Land Trust as an example, because they're already bioregional. Their context is a major watershed system. They've already organized with water. And their vision is basically the regeneration of that watershed, as you could see, even in the simple way I described what they do. And so I think having a bioregional framework allows a land trust to have much higher capacity than just a land trust for some other purpose. So I would say, if you're going to work with a land trust, you want to be sure their level of thinking is holistic enough. And if they're not, maybe you want to create a different one. So just to say that land trust is like a set of tools, really useful tools. But without the right way of thinking, it's not going to get you where you need to go. And that's why for us, we already started with this bioregional framework, this regenerative framework, our territorial foundation, there's a lot of other stuff. But in the territorial foundation, no one wanted to own land. So here I am holding Oriental Agua. Where the hell's the land going to go? And it's been sitting in a kind of purgatory because it wasn't allowed into the territorial foundation. And now we see why. We have a much better model here than we would have had if we'd done something more, quick and easy a couple years ago. And so that bioregional and regenerative framework, that is hugely important. So I just encourage you to think about that as
I think the way it is now, the land trust by whatever people want to offer it. I don't think there's any holistic thing, but I think this is a wonderful new way to look at it because, they're all a small organization. They can't do everything. They should be prioritizing. Question, when you say land, do you mean land and water?
I would say that the anchor for what we're doing with Tierra Sagrada right now is around land ownership, which is the escritura or the deed. Not because that's our focus, but because that's the thing we want to get rid of. Mm-hmm. Which is to say, we see that as an obstacle. So we look at the world through ecological and hydrological connectivity and geologic connectivity. That's how we see the world. And then we see this parcelizing of land into land deeds as a barrier. But we have to focus on it to change it. We're like, here's a land deed defined this way. How can it be changed through social agreements? So I would think the deep way of thinking about land is the way the indigenous people would say it, where land means all of creation, the great spirit, the universe, like they would mean it in this really holistic way. And that's where we're going. But you have to get this private land ownership out of the way. So that's why there's this sort of like back and forth between the two.
I love this. I think this gives us huge possibilities for a couple of pieces of land to start. That's great.
Well, let's help the Genesee and the Finger Lakes get back to their sacred relationships. Super important. Dan, over to you.
Thank you. This is a great conversation. I'm a Californian and I'm in the, right now in the Marin Sonoma hub of our bioregion. We have two major land trusts. So that was one of my questions, was how to relate to the land trusts. I actually, in my private practice, I have a for-profit company, but I've also headed up an association for the last 20 years, which is a 501c6 as opposed to a 501c3. We have 40 different ways to incorporate in California, as you probably know. So my question for you, because I'm working on permit streamlining for bioresource management throughout the state, but I'm doing it with a compost coalition here in Sonoma County in North Bay, which includes, Marin, Sonoma, Napa, and up into Mendocino, because that's the Russian River watershed, right? So I'm just wanting to ask you, because I know we don't have a boatload of time here. I really love the conversation about conflict resolution, because I think that's core, and I know you know about ACT and pro-social and all the rest of it. And I was into integral leadership in action through the integral community. But it seems like to me that we're already trying to do something like this in California with our environmental regulations, and that's where we're having a problem even building compost facilities, because nobody wants something new built in their neighborhood or in their jurisdictions. So we have all the zoning laws that are doing a lot of what you're talking about, but they don't have the mission that you were pointing to. So I think that transition is something I'm working with the resource conservation districts, have soil hubs, and they just did that with the wine industry growers up here who are moving to regenerative grape, grape growing versus the old chemical, fertilizer and herbicide way. So I think we can transition with all forms of ownership, and that's what we have to do in our bioregion, because a lot of other people own the land, and including the government. But there is a growing indigenous population, like what you were pointing out, and we're trying to do better interactions with them and their relationships. So it seems like to transform bioregions, we need to have this kind of leadership no matter where our bioregion is. That's all.
Yeah,
I'm really loving this conversation.
I would agree with that. And a really good video, I'd have to go and find it. A friend of mine, his name is Alan Honick, and he lives on Bainbridge Island, which is near Seattle. And Alan's a documentary filmmaker. He made this amazing movie. It's like 15 or 20 minutes long. I think it's called Seeing the Forest, but I'd have to go and find it. And it's about the conflict between the logging companies and the environmentalists in Oregon. And how they took a commons-based, like an Elinor Ostrom kind of approach, and they managed to discover that the fact that the logging roads were creating flood damage and flood risk, which harmed everyone, they actually found a way to create a commons framework that rose above their conflict. And then Alan Honick documented it as a pro-social process. But what was really powerful about it was moving cultural selection to a higher level of organization. And this is what your visionary leadership does, is moving to, well, okay, the loggers and the people protecting the spotted owl were famous for fighting each other, right? This was like the quintessential 80s battle in the environmental movement. Right. And they were exactly the people who came together and solved it.
Beautiful.
Like Weyerhaeuser and the environmentalists solved it together. And it was this way of facilitating moving up to a level of consciousness. Mm-hmm. While also incorporating the genuine needs of both sides. And so I think there's something to be said about that, and that could be another big conversation for us.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. It's super important. Marie, over to you.
I have been having a strong association, while you were talking, with the sites of Turkey of the prehistoric Neolithic period called Göbekli Tepe, and there's another one, because they seem to have been so communal in a way that we can't quite imagine now. They are great big sort of labyrinthian structures with megalithic supports, so that everything can be connected and supported. And every house, every household was connected to the other. So there are no streets, and everybody would actually go through everybody else's territory in order to meet everybody else. And every area of work was also incorporated within the structure. And the actual land to grow thing was also incorporated in the structure. It's just such a level of communal living with no notion of private property at all. The other thing that was striking about it is that everybody was buried in the structure. That is, you slept on your ancestors. It was under your bed. And all that sort of gives me an idea how far we've moved away from all that. And that was 8,000, 10,000 years ago. The other one example that came to mind was the African semi-arid land, particularly, but African in general, where there's still primarily communal land. And I was struck when I was looking in Nigeria, going through there, researching, that land changes stewardship. It couldn't even be called ownership, depending on what state it is. Like if it is on the water, then a whole community of fishermen will take over the management of it. If it is dry, then it will be a community of, say, millet growers. If the elephants have come, then it will be a community that specializes in hunting and, dealing with stock and stuff like that. So that's just two examples that was in my mind about much more advanced ways of communal land, non-ownership, you might call it, stewardship or being on the land. That we're going to have to take down a hell of a lot of structures in order to arrive back at that.
Thank you, Marie. These are so inspirational for anyone who knows about these systems that she's referring to. And I'm thinking of what are they called? The Subaks that were in Indonesia. These incredible commons-based management systems that evolve over hundreds or thousands of years. And one of the key things is that the commons, which in this case is large-scale landscape systems, humans integrate themselves into the patterns of them. And so, and this is that big thing of how I said the deepest way to decolonize is going to be to decolonize our relationship to land. Not because it's only about land, but because it actually ends up being about everything. It ends up being like with the Subaks in Indonesia. There's a huge part about this network of temples and the different spirits of the different tributaries and the spiritual and religious component and all of the ceremonies, which of course are tied to natural cycles, which means they do very, very strong ecological land system management, very strong, fully integrated into their spiritual system and their cosmovision. We see a lot of that here in Latin America with the indigenous peoples, very deeply ingrained spiritual systems and land management systems. So just to say, hell yes, more of that, please. Thank you, Marie. And then over to you, Claire.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, that kind of ties in well to my question was, maybe I'll just make the link and then go to it, is thinking about the loss of indigenous languages and place names, which help us understand the land, and the language groupings which indicate trade routes, like if you go to nativeland.ca. So yeah, I'm just wondering about the role of bioregional mapping in what you're doing, because to me, that participatory process, I just love what you were bringing in about all of the players that need to be involved in the conversation being invited in. But I am wondering about the larger community being able to even hold the story of that place, where they sort of the way they look at the land is through the lens of a whole system. Yeah, so just wondering if you have done bioregional mapping and like what that what that might have looked like. And just one other thing was just to go to what John brought up with having conversations that continually go back to first principles, so that you're the incoherence is kind of minimized by what you're just lifting up. So
Claire, these are such good questions. I'll start with the second one and actually answer that for John as well, at least a little bit, because I didn't do it earlier. Just to say, in our process with our territorial foundation, if Penny was on screen, you'd see her rolling her eyes at how many times we've gone back to our basic agreements that people keep re-forgetting. Like, it's in the notes. You said yes. Do you not remember? And how important it is to go back and talk about it again, rather than just say, check mark, we already talked about that 6 months ago. To actually hold the space to talk about it again is actually really important. To re-socialize it, to bring it back into the social context appropriately again. Yes, it feels inefficient when your goal is to get to the objective, because it is, if that's the way you're thinking. But if the goal is to be coherent, then you're always coming back to it. It's just part of what you're doing. So I want to name that as yes. And then about bioregional mapping, I would say we're doing bioregional mapping all over the place. And I'm going to give an example that's fresh this morning, because it was part of what got my blood pressure up this morning, but in a positive way. I was getting excited this morning. Is we actually had a kind of a terrible thing happen this week. Someone's building another housing development, and they went in with big bulldozers and they cut down some beautiful big trees right next to the river at the bottom of the town, which created a crisis because it's against the law and it's highly visible. And the mayor's office approved it, because if you have money, people just look the other way, as a standard, local corruption thing. And all these people like getting petitions and all this action. So this context of crisis. So I decided to go down there and take some pictures. I walked down there and took some photographs. But we created this, we're calling it the Creative Agency of Barichara, as a playful name. I've gathered a group of storytellers and we're starting to tell stories. And we agreed that we'd have stories that we've already got like sort of programmed in. And then we have space to have emergent stories. So I just sent the pictures to everyone. We started a little back and forth. And I said, how does everyone feel about us just making a video about the Centro Verde, about the greenbelt of the town? Because this place where this happened is in the greenbelt. And no one seems to know about the greenbelt, or that it's legally protected, or that it's this beautiful, awesome thing. Why don't we just make like a 4-minute video about the greenbelt and about the kids who have already been restoring and protecting the greenbelt. Because the birth of our school, Sueños del Bosque, literally the first activity was we brought kids together to create seed bombs, which is like clay packed, filled with native seeds to throw on the riverbed so that they would just start to grow. There's this seed bomb approach. So we had the kids make mud balls and throw them into the river as the beginning of Sueños del Bosque. So I have photographs. I was like, I could share the pictures of that. And then we contacted our friend Sergio, who's been doing the GIS mapping, the geospatial mapping, which we hired him. He's part of the team of our territorial foundation. He's been creating great maps. And he said, I've got these maps of the Cinturón Verde, of the Greenbelt, but they actually say the law is wrong and don't set the restrictions right. So I could share the map, but it'll actually teach people the wrong level of protection. There's more protection than is on the map. So if we're going to show a map, let's at least get the map right, because he's trying to update the maps. And so you can see the bioregional mapping, there's GIS. There's actually like a cartoon-like diagram of what is the Cinturón Verde and what's its relationship to the town. There's photographs of kids like playing in the mud and throwing them into the river. Like you can see like various levels. And I was just like this morning before all of my calls started, gathering photos and putting them into a Google folder, a Google Drive folder to pass to the team that's going to make a video and working with the GIS mapper to send us the maps. And we're like in live, like a living process, doing a community art bioregional mapping process.
Joe, I just want to say, having come from Barichara and seen some of that storytelling team, I am so excited, and I love how you've woven in the bioregional mapping with the storytelling. That's amazing. Thanks.
Yeah, so it's just like what we realized was we could just complain about what was going on and make a video that would incite people to anger. But like that's not the point. The point is there's no consciousness and there's a bunch of ignorance. People just don't know the damn law. It's actually national law in Colombia. You cannot build within 30 meters to either side of any waterway. That's Colombian law. Every mayor's office should know that. Every planning office should know that. And the local people in the planning office don't even know it. So we're like, oh, this is an education opportunity. Like, what's the most beautiful thing? Well, it's the kids protecting the greenbelt, and the kids know it better than the grown-ups in the frickin' planning office. Okay, well, we don't have to chastise anyone. Let's just make a beautiful video about the greenbelt with the kids restoring it and protecting it. That'll go all over the town. And so that was the idea. And then that sort of invoked this whole bioregional mapping, creative storytelling process. So one little example of many that could be told, but yes, bioregional mapping's all over the place. Steve, over to you.
Well, wow. That last dialogue was just such a beautiful weaving of satellite images to legal protections on the greenbelt definition to the photos of kids to weaving in storytelling. That is what place-based organizing, I think, is all about, is being able to weave those. So what a beautiful, beautiful example. I just wanted to bring in, I was kind of listening into the narrative way you told the story of what's unfolding there, and kind of mentally doing a checklist against pro-social core design principles to see what might have been naturally emerging. I'll put a picture of those in the chat, I guess. The thing I love about those principles is they're not somebody's theory, they're observations of what successful efforts seem to have in common. And you need all of them, right? And so to me, it feels like using them as a checklist. They also don't say how to do it. They just say what you need to have in place. So to be successful in your effort, you should have, shared identity and purpose. The shared identity includes knowing who's in the group, what are the rules of membership, and you talked about inviting people back in and that process, Joe. The equitable distribution of contributions and benefits, and Penny, you brought in the reciprocal agreements, the reciprocity agreements. The challenges in monitoring behavior and having and Rachel brought in the psychological maturity needed. It's not just what's written down, it's how have we grown as a collection of people in resolving conflict and so forth. Anyway, the reason I brought it up is just to maybe you could comment on the role that it could play as a checklist, right? Because as you are forming these organizations, you can use the natural emergence of challenges, but then go back and say, all right, do we have this covered, or is there some principle that as an organization we haven't yet really come to grips with, and this is the opportunity to do so. So I guess I'm asking, number one, because I know you're very familiar with pro-social, the extent to which you sort of were formally holding that in your head through this process, and this idea of a checklist of, yeah, maybe at some point we know we're going to need to cover all of these because the absence of even one can undermine our success.
Steve, I feel like you lobbed me a softball to knock out of the park or something.
Yeah.
As some of you know, I've given talks on these core design principles multiple times in Earth Regenerators and the design school and in just general context of practice. And I would say for me personally, I am very conscious and intentional about bringing all 8 of those core design principles. And basically, like one of the things that happened on Monday, where I sort of like have this shiver in my body when someone says something I know is wrong, but I'm not the teacher, so I don't have to teach them or correct them. Because I heard someone say, well, the commons means that it's for everyone. And I'm like, no, it's not. That's not a commons. I'm not going to say that here. I'm not in the job of correcting someone, but I won't name the person in our territorial foundation. Some of you know the person, but they got it completely wrong. It's like, oh, you have to include everyone in the territory. I'm like, you want nothing to work? That's not how commons work. And so the way that I would say it is this, is that I like to describe those 8 core design principles of Elinor Ostrom. I like to frame them as systems capacities. I say a commons is a self-organizing and self-managing system for purposeful action, which is why David Sloan Wilson generalized Elinor Ostrom's principle that every living organism is a commons. Your body with 37 trillion cells is a commons because it's a self-organizing, purposeful system. Its purpose is the health and well-being or the reproductive strategies or whatever part of evolution you want to pick, and Elinor Ostrom's principles apply. And the reason I like to call them systems capacities is they're systems capacities for self-governance. Shared identity and purpose means you know who you are and what you're governing. You can answer these basic questions, which is why a commons is not everyone. It's not like everyone who lives in the territory. I'm like, so the guy that wants to build a casino and have a brothel is not aligned in the purpose of protecting the water. We don't have shared identity and purpose. We're not in the same commons. And so you have to be able to recognize that there's this diversity and that there are some commons that actually have to win in a competition with other commons. The commons that protects the well-being of water needs to win, or else you're gonna have a future where it's an unlivable place because the water has to be cared for. So things like this. And so I think of them as 8 core systems capacities for self-governance. And think of them not so much as existing or not existing, but as how healthy are they or how mature or complete are they? Like fast and fair conflict resolution, when in practice, that means a lot of different things. Like, do we have a robust dynamic capacity for adaptive response to conflict? See, that's a systems capacity. Not did we set a rule for how conflicts get resolved that applies to some kinds of conflicts but not others. That's why I prefer to frame it as a system capacity. And so yeah, it's super important. And Penny and I were explicit. Tierra Sagrada is about bringing land into the commons. So we need the commons core design principles to be there. So we were very intentional about that. Which is why I love that you lobbed me that softball. I was like, yes, that's why it has the form it does. And that's why if the form it has looks like sociocracy. Because actually underneath sociocracy, when it's working, it's actually commons-based governance as well. And so it's not accidental that the forms conform, that the patterns emerge that way. So So I'm wondering, are there any other questions or comments about the conversation today? It's been so rich. Just want to make space for it. And John, yes, please, come on in.
On LinkedIn, I've been following, as you're aware, the Will Reddick's work with the, and I wonder if you guys have tried something similar, because a thing I'm struck with these groups is, oh my, look at all these people with so much skills, potentially so much time, so much capacity. And so I'm very curious if the grassroots economics type of models can find some kind of manifestations either in groups like this or in other groups. Because I think of my own peer group where we're all filmmakers who are highly skilled and highly unemployed for the most part at this point in time. So these notions of like almost coming up with a resume of skills we're willing to share. Because I think, like, for instance, like I make videos. I'm hearing you're making videos, and all these things. I'm sure there's people in the group who are engineers, and I know there's people in the groups who come from finance. And I know some people don't like touching on finance, but to me, finance is just engineering. It is just engineering if done right, Anyhow, I'm just throwing that out there, but.
Well, it's funny you say that because back in 2022, we had a gathering called Refi Barichara. Will Reddick was one of the people who came to Barichara, and then afterwards remained in relationship with a local project called Casa Común, which is this web of processes for creating regenerative economic models and mutual aid systems. Like really awesome things happen at Casa Común. Those of you who were with us in the immersion, we had lunch every day at Casa Común. It was like amazing. And right now, with the commitment pooling model of grassroots economics, Will Reddick is working with Felipe Spath, who's part of the team at Sueños del Bosque and at Casa Común, to bring that commitment pooling framework to Casa Común. So literally, grassroots economics is working with some people in Barichara. So that's my beautifully direct answer to that question. I realized there was a question that you asked earlier that I thought was a really good one. I just wanted to pick up again, which is what do we do with bad actors? Because Penny and I dealt with a bad actor, someone who was malicious, psychopathic, strategic, destructive, and patient, and they did a lot of damage. And one of the things that actually was the impulse for creating Tierra Sagrada was when we had this attempt where I spent 3 years trying to bring a very strategic piece of land into the commons. This person was the donor. They destroyed that whole process. They participated in killing the Earth Regenerators community. They did a lot of damage because they were very strategic. And one of the things that we started to do was to say, what can we learn from that land Las Albercas? And it was actually Felipe, the person I mentioned before, doing this conflict transformation work, going back and figuring out what happened and what can we learn and what are the evolutionary potentials from that conflict. That process of learning is how Penny and I created Tierra Sagrada. We created Tierra Sagrada from the direct learnings of dealing with a malicious bad actor. Now, obviously, we'll learn from other things too, but we got a lot of lessons from what we did wrong there.
That's awesome because it's almost like an immune response. The system gets challenged and then it has to contain or anyhow.
It's very much an immune response. And just like how your body develops immune resistance to a virus, it actually chemically alters your body's processing. Yes, our immune response to that experience was creating Tierra Sagrada. And that's not the only reason, but there's a lot of very smart design in what we did wrong in the previous round. So that's a big part of this learning process. But yes, so bad actors are very helpful if they don't manage to be as damaging as ours was.
It's also a good illustration of how the shadow brings out the light, and how you should never discount the shadow's contribution, because it is powerful. It's powerful.
And also that this thing we said earlier, we invite the conflict. We invite. We don't just tolerate. We invite the conflict into the process now. That's a design principle. Invite the conflict, but at the appropriate stage, which is very early, but not the first step. So there's a lot of learning here. Claire, over to you.
Yeah, I think this kind of brings up something I've brought up before, but is the more insidious bad actors, like the policy that allows for buying up of land. And I think, I know that certainly in North American cities and where we live is just uh, it it's almost like it's so normalized and it's out of sight, out of mind. Sometimes they're numbered companies, sometimes they're just anyway. Just I think why I'm bringing it up is it's happening at such a scale that it feels like the people who are coming together to do the land, like trying to put land back into the commons, the land prices have been up so much, but also it takes a while for a group to come together. And in the meantime, there's like a swoop and buying out of the land. So I'm just bringing that up, that I think it's like the granular level of what you're dealing with actual recognizable bad actors. And there's an insidious, like much larger thing. And just sort of realizing some of that probably needs to be tackled at a policy level, but at a yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because, yeah, it's like huge concern here.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. One of the things that came up for us on Monday at our meeting with the Territorial Foundation is a woman named Emilce, who you met at Kene Colibri. And she had this beautiful observation, which was we need what we're talking about Tierra Sagrada to go so extreme that the whole community considers the whole territory a commons. And she said there are two places in Colombia right now where the indigenous people have actually declared their territory a commons and it's not allowed to be sold. You cannot legally buy the land by their own rules. And she's like, that's the long term, is the territory holds the control of selling the land. Because right now, yeah, we can do beautiful things on Las Ruinas, but during the 2 years we set up that process, 500 other pieces of land got turned into hotels with too much water demand and other things. So the sheer exponential rate. And by the way, the land in Barichara is between 10 and 20 times what it cost 5 years ago. We're in a huge speculative bubble right now, which has no future. Speculative bubbles always burst, but in the meantime, it can do a huge amount of damage. And so we're in the midst of that, but we have to normalize the ethic that land is sacred, which is why in parallel with Tierra Sagrada, there's this big focus on regenerative education for children. And so like we need land to be sacred for everyone, not just the land that Tierra Sagrada manages. So there are multiple levels to this, but yeah, it's a huge deal. So that's all I'll say for now. And then Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, such a rich conversation. I'm loving it. And I just wanted to add a couple of things that I'm being reminded of as I'm listening, is that and along the lines of inviting the conflict. And yes, there have been threads of that in the organisations I've been with the last few years. And what became really clear to me is that you need to have a mechanism whereby you can ask somebody to leave, and you need to be able to say, once you've gone through your mechanism, and a conflict resolution circle or conflict transformation circle probably isn't going to be the first step in the mechanism, but yeah, at some point, there needs to be some way of saying this project cannot meet your needs. Yeah, and so it's probably best that we go our separate ways. And then something that really helped me when I was working with other members in our organisation was that consent-based decision-making, like sociocracy, can be so helpful for holding really complex decisions and also sharing the responsibility of making that decision, and making a decision based on there's no objection is really helpful for forward motion. And you can kind of, if you're feeling worried about something that's coming up, you can just drop it into the circle, and the wisdom that can come through in that way, and sorting out such complex things in quite a really magical way of alchemy. I don't know what happens, but yeah, it's quite amazing. And then and sociocracy seemed to be what Ted Rao at Sociocracy for All says is NVC at the organizational scale. So those kind of processes are so fantastic, just for creating that safe container. As long as everybody buys into sociocracy. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I'll make one comment going back to what Steve Melville brought in about the 8 core design principles. One of them sometimes goes by the name of graduated sanctions, which is a way of saying there are different levels of consequences, which is really important for adaptive response. And if you've ever looked at the work of Christopher Boehm, the anthropologist used to work with Jane Goodall and then went from studying non-human primates to human primates, he found that graduated sanctions are fundamental. The ability to ostracize, exclude, and in some cases exterminate, like a serial killer in a hunter-gatherer society. And Christopher Boehm documented that in hunter-gatherer cultures. But just to say there are graduated sanctions, and there are different levels of response, hugely important. And consent versus consensus brings you into graduated sanctions so much more powerfully for all the reasons you named. So I just endorsing it. I completely agree. I find consensus to be the wrong approach most of the time, but it's the easiest to understand that people think is fair. And so it's way overused. And so just agreeing with you there. Totally.
Yeah, the window of growing people's windows of tolerance is a really beautiful and expansive and connecting thing. Love it.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And then Marie, over to you.
Yeah, there was a comment now from John Hepworth in the chat about the housing stock that the government used to own in Canada. It's the same here in the UK. Under Thatcher, all the council housing was sold with the right to buy, which was hugely popular. And now we have an enormous housing crisis because there's no more council housing. And the connection in my mind just before I saw this comment was this immortality. Property is intimately linked with immortality. When the concept of property came in at the same time as the whole search for immortality of Gilgamesh and all that, because you can pass it on to your descendants and you can also build up your descendants' wealth. And like you said now, Joe, it does amount to exterminating the others eventually. Yeah, so the fear of death is so intimately linked. I wonder how you're addressing it, how we can address it.
Wow, what a rich question that we'll be able to end on today, because we're getting close to time. And to say one of the ways that I'm addressing it is, I do this work in the Bioparque and it's very sacred to me. And one of the things I got to do last year was my sister passed away and I spread her ashes to different special places for her in Missouri. But then I brought some of her ashes and placed them in my sanctuary forest in the Bioparque. So part of my sister's body is now in the Bioparque. And this relates, I think there are many ways we can explore this question, but it relates to, I feel much comfortable with the death of my sister when she's still with me, because she and I are connected through land. We're not connected through land in the way that I own the right to extract from the land. No, we're connected through land because I blessed the land with her ashes. And now when I go to the land, I feel my blessing of my sister. My sister's birthday was a couple of weeks ago, and I went and smoked tobacco. My sister was a chain smoker. I smoked tobacco in more of the indigenous way, like a connection with the ancestry and all that. She was just a chain smoker. But I went and smoked with my sister in the Bioparque. and I have land connection. So you see how the death and the immortality, part of the division is separating humans from land and then making there be an afterlife somewhere else. And so there are lots of ways. That's just one little way. I think there are lots
that
of ways.
makes sense of the people in Gobli Tepe sleeping on their ancestors' ashes.
Yeah.
And also what you said about chain smoking, addiction. Addiction is renowned for stemming from the lack of connection, when we don't feel held in connection with all.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Marie, because it's so true that like what all of us is looking for is connection to deep belonging to each other, to love, to beauty, to purpose. And whether we realize it or not, it's connected to land relationship. And once we realize that, it's a big insight. So that's why Tierra Sagrada, why we called it that, is that we know that by changing our relationship to land, we open up an emotional and spiritual space for the sacred to return. And that this is a very important part of the work. And so, yeah, we want that land, Las Ruinas, to not be a bar or a discotheque, and we want it to be a school for kids for restoring the forest, because those are all great ideas. But we also want the children to know the Bioparque is sacred. And the Las Ruinas is at the entrance to the Bioparque. So we have this way in which we sort of sneak it in a certain sense. It's not really sneaking it in because it's so explicit in our story, but that even someone who doesn't understand what it means to have sacred land relation is going to come to discover it if they stay in relation to the land for a purpose bigger than human purpose for long enough. And so we're cultivating the cultural soils for that. So I want to thank you all for this beautiful conversation. Wow, we've gone in a lot of very interesting places. And just to say that when Penny and I got to the point of clarity about creating Tierra Sagrada, at that time, we felt like the most powerful thing we were doing was creating Sueños del Bosque. Because this last year, we're creating this children's school and it's so inspiring and so wholesome. But then we started realizing that Tierra Sagrada may end up being our most important work. Even with what we're doing in the design school and this big picture stuff, if we can actually create a real viable pathway for humans in this territory to come back into sacred relationship with land, this might be the most important thing we do in our lives. And we feel it at that depth. And so, and it's very much connected to, this is the Regenerative Finance Lab. This is very connected to finance because it's very much connected to the flow, the storage, and the transformation of value, which is what finance is about. Like you bring money into a territory and what does it do if it's regenerative? It does those things with value. And so we see this as a way of really concretely, we could structure a financial package for our territory that includes land, because land can bring humans back into sacred relationship. And we can build sustainable food systems and textiles and fiber sheds and the other things that are worthy of financial investment. And so just to connect that dot at the very end, the whole time we've actually been talking about regenerative finance. This whole conversation. But governance and configuration and composition and assets and capital and value, they're all entangled in this. But without the sacred, to go back to that old, the book title from Charles Eisenstein, it's Sacred Economics. Without the sacred, what are we doing it for? And so this is a deep pathway into regenerative finance, is to concretely restore sacred relationships with land. So with that, I hope this inspires you where you are. I hope this inspires you to help us where we are in Barichara, for us to learn with each other. Like if Jonathan and Victoria have to create their own Tierra Sagrada for the Finger Lakes, you've got learning partners right here. So onward we go. And thank you everyone for your rich practical knowledge and experience and for a wonderful discussion. So with that, onward, fellow humans, and we'll see you all very soon.